Good morning or afternoon, I should say, everyone. We're so excited to have you join us this afternoon for another dynamic presentation regarding related to children's environmental health. Today's speaker is Claire Burnett, and we're so excited to have her join us. She's the founder and executive director of the Healthy Schools Network. She began this organization in 1995 from its roots in New York into the nation's premier voice for children's environmental health at school by advancing a comprehensive policy agenda, fostering state and local environmental health coalitions across the country, and securing landmark reforms in states and federally. She shifted her focus to children's environmental health in the aftermath of her own child's pesticide exposure at school. In 2017, she was honored to receive 3 national awards: the William K. Riley Award for Environmental Leadership and Innovation from American University School of Public Policy, the U.S. EPA Indoor Air Quality Champion recognition, as well as the David P. Rawl Award for contributions to public health through science-based advocacy from the American Public Health Association at its annual conference in Atlanta. So please join me in welcoming Claire Burnett. Claire, do you have the floor?
Thank you so much, LaShawn. It's a pleasure to be with you. Let's see, we have. There we go. So good morning and good afternoon, no matter where you are in the country. If you're all in the Southeast, good afternoon. I'm in upstate New York and it's unseasonably warm. So we were just, as we were prepping, we were talking about tomatoes and zucchini and marigolds and things like that. My focus today is healthy learning environments. And I think probably a lot of you are familiar with some of the basics. So we're going to take this one step into what healthy learning environments can mean, and that's to take a bit of a look at climate disasters and the impacts on schools. So Healthy Schools Network, as LaShawn said, was first convened in 1995 to support something which the New York State Board of Regents, the volunteer governing board for the K-12 and the education and the university system in New York, had adopted, that every child has a right to an environmentally healthy school that's clean and in good repair. And of course, when I heard them say that and adopt it in a formal meeting, I thought, well, that's easy, the job's done, you know? Well, it was not done. It takes a lot of work by everyone to get environmentally healthy schools that are clean and in good repair. Organizationally, we have an information and referral clearinghouse online. We convened our state, national, and local partners into a national coalition for healthier schools, through which we secured new authorizations and funds for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, an authorization for the Department of Education many years ago, and a separate portal for green and healthy products, both cleaning and other kinds of products in schools. So we hope you will take a look at that. Let's dive in here. We have a particular way, gotta move my, there we go. We have a particular way of framing the issues around schools that I want to share with you. I think most people understand that children are not biologically just little adults. Developmentally, they're not little adults. They breathe more air per pound of body weight. They eat more food, drink more water per pound of body weight. They cannot identify or articulate hazards or exposures. They have a long shelf life. So early exposures to children, which may disrupt their developmental path or their ability to learn, become lifetime disabilities. By the same token, schools are not just little offices. And this actually is something that's hard for a lot of people to understand. People are comfortable talking about homes or housing or apartments. They know what an office is or a workplace is. It's really difficult to think that schools are not just little offices, and they certainly aren't homes. They're constructed differently. They have different standards. They are essentially learning environments for children. There are over 65 million children in school and childcare facilities every single day of the school year, and in childcare more often all year. The schools in the US have a history of poor ventilation and sanitation. That means nobody's taking care of the buildings because they weren't built necessarily to have poor ventilation and sanitation. According to CDC, about 40% of US public school children today have pre-existing chronic health conditions. That might be learning disabilities, it certainly is asthma, it may be somebody on the autism or Asperger's spectrum, heart problems, cancer recuperation, and so forth. Diabetes, there are a lot of chronic health issues affecting children today, much more so, I think, than 10 or even 20 years ago. School children today in the US, more than half are children of color. Today's schools are more densely occupied than nursing homes and use more hours per week than offices. That sort of captures a lot of the challenges with dealing with schools. Is there's very little time, relatively speaking, given the utilization and the numbers of hours per week every week that schools are in use. That reduces the amount of time there is to clean and repair the building, while the occupancy density increases the amount of dirt and grime and traffic in the building. So it's really a tough issue. One of the things I want to share with you is something I was happy to see back in the summer. In the summer, the Federal Department of Education launched a webinar series on safe and healthy schools, and EPA was the presenter along with CDC. It was the first three-way that we had seen in a very, very long time, and we were really thrilled to hear that there was a three-way. The EPA's Indoor Environments Division, Indoor Air Quality Tools for Schools program, had about 20 minutes or so to give a very general, very good, but very general overview of indoor air quality and why it's important. So I was very excited. I immediately went back and called my friends in the Indoor Environments Division at EPA and said, what's next? When do you get to do the next one? And they explained that the Department of Education was no longer interested in indoor air, but it was going to turn its focus to mental health. So having Education Department and having CDC pay attention to EPA, which has the only agency authorization on indoor air and healthy environments in schools, has been a tougher issue than it should be. So there are key elements to healthy learning environments, and we're going to come back and finish up this particular webinar with this slide. So give everybody time to think about it and ask some questions. Healthy learning environments are not simple. It's a good idea to get it right from the get-go. So that means investigating the site where you're going to build and preparing the site. It means designing and engineering correctly for the occupants of the building. It means construction techniques. It should mean commissioning of building systems, meaning an independent entity, not the contractor, comes back and double checks, did you install the air conditioning, the heating, and the ventilating the way it was supposed to be done? Is it operating properly? Is staff trained to operate the new equipment? That is a frequent problem with these high performance schools, particularly LEED rated schools, which are not required, but they may, but they're not required to actually offer staff training. Preventive maintenance has to be right. Schools have to have an intact building envelope. For those who may not know, the envelope is the roof, the windows, the doors, the foundation. It's that entire outer shell. If it's not intact, you're already in trouble in terms of water, moisture, pest control, and everything else. There also should be a complaint resolution or a feedback loop. The occupants of the building are often the very first people to understand that there's something that isn't quite right. So every public health agency in the country, in terms of indoor environments, will tell you to take the first complaint seriously and explore it thoroughly. Dig in and make sure you understand exactly what went wrong and how to fix it. or how to respond to the complainant. Also, community information and support is important. Well, why are these things? What could go wrong? Well, you know, everything has gone wrong in many cases with too many schools. Site hazards, chemical vapor intrusions, water intrusions for poor siting. If it's not designed and engineered properly, you have poor ventilation, high heat, other problems like that. With construction, there are foundation holes and pests and leaks. Commissioning of systems, if they're not working the way they're supposed to, then you're not going to have good water distribution, good air distribution, or good plumbing. If staff are not trained and don't know how to work the systems will not be maintained and the equipment will start to deteriorate. And that's happened in quite a few schools where they haven't had, either they don't know how to do it or they haven't had the funds to do it. An intact building envelope, if it's not intact, there are going to be weaknesses in the building envelope. And that is an element that causes more things to go wrong in case of a weather disaster. When there is no complaint resolution system, that means there's a lack of attention to a growing list of problems and probably a growing list of unhappy occupants. If there's no community information or support, then there's not going to be a support network out there about the building and grounds, then there's not going to be any support for repairs. So it's important to pay attention to all of these things. Whoop. There we go. So the benefits of having healthy learning environments include quite a few elements. You do have healthier children and staff, which everybody wants. It means fewer school nurse trips, and that means more seat time for children. Better average daily attendance. I believe most states, if not all states, reimbursed average daily attendance because attendance and seat time are really critical to learning outcomes. Healthy buildings and healthy environments inside buildings also mean better test scores, easier learning. That certainly means happier parents and a more supportive community. It also means less administrative aggravation. It's very difficult to have a lot of things go wrong with a building and not be able to fix them you can't turn around on a dime and fix a roof. It takes time, it takes money, it takes outside contractors and so forth. And that really leads to something else, which is an important local asset. Schools are not heavy equipment construction pieces. Yes, there may be a steam shovel or a bulldozer when you're first getting underway, but by and large, the jobs to build and maintain and sustain school buildings are jobs in the trades. Plumbers, masons, glaziers, electricians, carpenters, painters. These are local jobs, more or less, not necessarily jobs at a interstate level where you have very large international and national corporations engaged in very heavy construction. So there are a lot of benefits to taking care of local schools. So what do we know about schools pre-disaster right now? The current state of schools is not a great state of affairs right now. Physical locations can be wet or contaminated or hazardous. Everybody understands wet, everybody understands a contaminated site. Hazards might be proximity to an airport or to a major highway, and that creates fumes and noise. Indoor environmental risks to health, thinking, and learning include a long, long list of things that result from things going wrong. It means asbestos and PCBs and lead, which are legacy toxics in school infrastructure. It could mean poor indoor and outdoor air quality, moisture and mold, the presence of pests and pesticides, may mean radon. There are schools all over the country in high radon areas, asthma and allergy triggers, mercury and chemical fumes, chemical mismanagement. I have some more slides about that later. Extraneous noise. Noise is very difficult in classrooms because learning depends on teacher and student communication. Poor lighting is also associated with difficulties in learning, and poor sanitation and overcrowded overcrowding are, of course. High heat and humidity also are disruptive to learning and disruptive to test scores. Generally, the states are not tracking school facilities, and they're actually not tracking what happens to children. There is no state that actually has a system to intervene for children at risk or with exposures in school or childcare settings. It doesn't happen. The other thing that has emerged with the pandemic, and this is very specific, that there aren't any states that actually require schools to have some sort of comprehensive infection prevention and control plan. Many schools in many states may talk about preventing infection. If you dig into it, it may mean something as simple as a school nurse sends a sick child home. It does not mean that there is a comprehensive plan to prevent infections to begin with that would include, for example, clean air and clean water. So if you look at infection control plans for hospital or clinical settings or for nursing homes, I'm not saying schools need to be in that category, but they are very densely occupied and many of the children have pre-existing health problems. So they're, in our view and the view of the Harvard COVID Collaborative and the view of the American Public Health Association and many other organizations, it's about time for states to develop comprehensive infection prevention and control plans for local schools. Let's take a look at what some of the things that, that can happen. A custodial closet is on the upper left. That's a dirty closet. And if you have a dirty custodial closet, you're going to have a dirty school. You need clean equipment. The center is a moldy cubby, coat hanging place for elementary children in Philadelphia. A Cool Whip container, including about 40 pounds of elemental mercury. Obviously, that's a bad idea. The top right are bird feathers and bird droppings in the top floor of a school where the roof was no longer intact. PCB warning, don't drink the water, elevated lead, and an example of really very questionable chemical storage. If you look at the jelly jar on the left, nobody has any idea what's in there or if it should even be stored there. These are some pictures, very current pictures from chemical risks in schools, and this is from New York State. The New York State Department of Environmental Conservation has been engaged for several years, working with other agencies, including state ed, to do school chemical cleanouts. Some of you may recall that EPA in 2007 actually launched a national school chemical cleanout campaign. It's no longer funded particularly, but a lot of the material is still active and it's available online. So these pictures actually come from what New York State DEC found in local schools. Potassium, a variety of problems inside a leaky refrigerator. This is part of an overall clean out partway into the process. And I have to remind everybody that when you look to dispose of hazardous chemicals, you need to be able to identify them. You want them in properly labeled and in the original container. That's obviously not what's happening here. And you need to be able to identify them specifically so that you know how to handle and dispose of them. Are they explosive? Are they corrosive? Are they combustible? There are a lot of big questions here. There's another kind of disaster here, and this is a climate disaster. This is from Houston, taking children back and forth between school and the school bus. A warming climate presents a lot of different risks to children and to schools as well. Children are vulnerable segments of the overall population, particularly hard hit by climate change or communities of color, low income communities. Children are actually at risk because they breathe more air per pound of body weight and the air is more polluted. Climate change will impact children in other ways through displacement and separation from their families, injuries, asthma and allergies, infectious diseases, more missed school days. We're all seeing what happens with weeks and weeks and weeks, if not years, of missed school right now during the pandemic. There are more high heat days. there will be more pests and more pesticides. We're already seeing that. More heat and humidity. We are already seeing that. All of those mean worse indoor air quality and indoor environmental quality in schools and in childcare facilities. And indoor air is already not great. So we're going to call these unloved schools. We don't want to call them unloved children, but we're going to call this unloved schools. What happens? What are the risks in unloved schools? We know what some of the current problems are. Very few schools actually have air conditioning. I'm speaking now largely of the Northeast. I think in Georgia, where many of you are, a lot of schools were built with air conditioning, but that's not true across the country. More than half of the schools in New York State have no AC system. There's also a big question about the adequacy of the electrical systems. For example, one of the recommended remediations or mitigations for COVID is to install room size air cleaners. If you install one in every single classroom in an old school building, do you actually have an electrical system for the building that will handle that electrical load? Another problem, obviously, poor ventilation, weeds, building envelopes not intact. The facility and the grounds are not resilient to a lot more water or drought, or resilient in any way to encroaching fires. Facilities are not meeting indoor air quality current professional codes to begin with. And there are fewer support staff today than there were 10 or 15 years ago. And those are generally the facility workers in the building trades, nurses, and support staff in the classroom. The poorest schools, as well as many other schools, actually lack the financial and staff resources to engage in climate adaptation, recovery, and remediation. This is sort of a tough love moment in terms of energy retrofits. I want to be really careful about this. We do know that sealed buildings lead to problems. We know that reduced ventilation to save energy leads to problems. We know that hasty building renovations can go wrong. We know that conventional green buildings don't necessarily deal well with healthy indoor environments. We have an example out of New York that I've been calling a Marie Antoinette example. Well-intended, wonderful program called Solar Schools in New York City, with solar roofs, solar power, really energizing the entire building. Highly regarded program in the environmental community. The pandemic comes along, the Department of Education in New York City investigated all their ventilation systems. What did they do? Well, we can't fix your ventilation system. You have pest problems, you have mold problems, you have overcrowding. The lighting's not very good, but we can give you a solar roof. So, you know, the real quote from Marie Antoinette was that when there is no bread, let them eat cake. And it does seem to me this is a little bit of a let them eat cake moment, to do energy retrofits on schools without beginning to pay attention to the quality of the indoor environment. We ran into that issue with the Department of Energy not more than 2 or 3 months ago. We're running into that issue now in New York State. We just want to do the energy retrofit with renewables. We'll do solar, we'll do a lot of other things, but we really don't have time to look at the indoor environment or the indoor air. I think this is a let them eat cake moment. Thanks. This is a great map. I tried to pull up some FEMA maps of the Georgia area. I wasn't successful in finding what I wanted, but the Pew Trust did a terrific map just a few years ago to identify the highest flood-prone areas in the country. This is a valuable resource. I hope they will redo this project. So what happens in flooded schools? Obviously, the chemicals wash out. The pests and the pesticides are going to be in the hallways and in the classrooms and in the carpeting. We have roof leaks. This is Missouri, and this is a massive suburban school, but look when it's been flooded. It was flooded in December of 2015. It was just flooded in 2019. It was flooded again with high heat warnings in 2019. This is a bad site, and this is what happens with poorly sited schools, or can happen. Here we are in Texas with Houston flooding. The school bus is making its way towards the school down a flooded street. And what do we know about children in damp buildings? We know that if they don't have asthma, they will become asthmatic. And we know that children with asthma will have more difficulties and require more rescue medications. So here are the children walking into their classrooms, and how are they doing it? They're walking on benches so they keep their sneakers dry. So the question is, why is the school open if they can't remediate and they're putting children in harm's way? Here's a Florida school that was damaged by a Category 5 hurricane in December 2018. It did not open until the spring of 2019, several months later. This is a really classic example of high heat difficulties in 2018. The heat index reached over 100 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Afternoon classes were canceled. There were school closures in Massachusetts, New Jersey, Connecticut, and Ohio. This is going to happen again and again and again. Protecting yourself is one way to do it. Having a school with some air conditioning or good ventilation is also going to help. So the question is, from the Houston school with children walking across the benches or bleacher benches in order to get to their classrooms, when is it safe for children to reoccupy a damaged building? And this came from the Los Angeles Times, from LAUSD, Los Angeles Unified School District teacher, recorded in October of 2019 after wildfires were prevalent in that area. And they simply said the smell was atrocious. They went into school, our eyes were burning, our throats were on fire even before the students arrived. Why were the students arriving? So that's not a new issue, as it turns out. Who's in charge when schools are damaged? We did some research way back, schools of ground zero after the World Center trade attacks in 2001. We also tracked what happened to schools after Hurricane Katrina, the Deepwater Horizon, oil spill, Superstorm Sandy, the Ebola break, which happened in New York City and Ohio, Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, Maria, and even Ida recently. There aren't any federal state health agencies. The health agencies issue health advisories, and they're not issuing them with child-specific environmental public health advisories for schools or for children. There's also a problem reaching schools. If you're in the public health system, you distribute through the public health system. If you're in the education system, you distribute through the education system. How does the health advisory reach the education system? And if it does at a federal level or the state level, will this federal or state education department redistribute in a timely fashion? That's a really big question. The other big question is, why is there not now any regulatory agency that actually clears a damaged school for safe reoccupancy by children? So there's enormous pressure at a local level, enormous pressure from parents who want to get back to cleaning up their property or whatever, or for businesses, as happened after schools of ground zero. We need to normalize the stock market. We're going to reopen the schools downtown. So who actually says, if you have a damaged, contaminated school, that it's safe for reoccupancy by children? There's enormous pressure on local school superintendents and state education folks or city education folks to reopen as quickly as possible. We actually published that in a book called Schools of Ground Zero, Early Lessons Learned in Children's Environmental Health. And that was presented at a U.S. Senate Environment hearing in October of 2002. Here's another example of what happens after a disaster. This is in New Orleans, and a wonderful activist, Monique Harden, worked incredibly hard because the Booker T. Washington School was built in 1940. Recently there was a plan right below it to close the Walter L. Cohen School building to move students to a new school proposed for construction on the city dump. So what's important about the Walter L. Cohen School down at the bottom is it was the first high school built for African-American students in all of New Orleans. Prior to that, everybody dropped out in the 8th grade. So the plan was to take the FEMA money for New Orleans after Katrina, demolish the Walter Cohen School, which had not been damaged by Katrina, it was on high ground, tear it down and build on the city dump. A lot of work took place to make sure that didn't happen. But I think one of the lessons there is that once FEMA releases funds, it is up to the local jurisdiction how it uses those funds. Here again is from Los Angeles Unified, which reopened. It was contaminated by wildfire smoke. So there are two pictures here from that. One is a protest by the local teachers. Thank goodness they did that. Otherwise, nobody would have known about it. And there was a wipe, and that was the soot that came off of a classroom desk. In schools of ground zero, there was not one agency, city, state, or federal, that intervened for children who were in contaminated buildings. The schools were reopened by the New York City Chancellor, who was at the time, had just previously been a vice president for a Wall Street trading firm. In 2012, Superstorm Sandy put 170 public schools in or adjacent to the storm surge. That's a saltwater storm surge. The state education department advised that schools could reopen. All they needed was power, water, and communications. They did not need to assess for any other damages. In 2021, just less than a month or so ago, Hurricane Ida flooded New Jersey and New York schools, and some reopened with absolutely no remediation. And they were flooded with sewage contaminated floodwaters. Even 3 weeks after the event, we had a technical assistance call from one of the schools that had been affected from a coach. And the coach went into the locker area and pulled out one of the big gym bags that included equipment for boys team, and the foul water poured out of the bag. So there was obviously no remediation that actually took place. So there's a big question about who's in charge right now. Is it FEMA? They do scan for structural damages, but they do defer to state and local teams for local in-depth assessments of local school buildings. Schools really are not a first priority. They are certainly critical infrastructure if you think about the impacts of schools on children and the impacts of schools on the overall economy, but schools are actually not treated as a top priority within the states or federally. There is no environmental public health system for children at risk or with exposures. Only 46 states actually have a school facility office. Only 38 have some sort of funding for school construction programs. And what's interesting, we did a research project with Johns Hopkins and the University of Arizona where it started, is that we could not find any of the states that actually had an assessment tool that a local volunteer team could use to assess the damages in schools, including environmental health damages. So if they are critical infrastructure, there are roles for many agencies, whether it's EPA, CDC, ATSDR, the Education Department, the Labor Department, FEMA, Energy, and so forth. We think schools are critical to children's health and to the economy, and therefore it would be important for agencies to clarify their roles, to coordinate, and to rapidly expand their efforts with guidance and funding and oversight for climate adaptations, mitigations, and the ability to recover quickly. Just putting children back into a reopened building that hasn't been remediated is not fair to the educators, and it's certainly not fair to children. So how do you recover rapidly and get schools back open in a safe and healthy way again? We think it needs to include comprehensive infection prevention and control plans, and include the siting, how to site new buildings, and how to deal with the retrofits of leaseholds. So in very crowded places like New York City, and I'm sure Los Angeles and other places, there may not be any more land to build a school within that particular jurisdiction. So people resort to leaseholds. What was the prior use of the building? Was it a mercury thermometer plant, or was it a regular office, paperwork office? So they're very different prior uses. It's important to understand what those are. So that brings us to the end, and there are a list of resources and credits for people. But I want to close by keeping this slide up online, and let's use that, LaShawn, if you would like, to get some of the Q&A moving through, because I think there are a lot of really interesting questions that come up with respect to schools, climate disasters, and the current state of school infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claire. We appreciate your wonderful presentation. You were very thorough. We understood clearly that there are many sources of contamination in schools. And you highlighted some pictures and showing us where to look and find where these things are hidden or stored, that sort of thing. And then looking at it from a natural disaster perspective. Now, sometimes we don't get the full impact of what happens after a disaster and what a school issues, the type of issues like school face when, dealing with reopening. But it was an awareness for all of us, to ask the question, who's dealing with this, who's managing it, who's on top of it, so that we maintain safe learning environments for all of our children, whether they're in elementary, middle, or high school, universities, even the daycare facilities. So one of the things I did look in the Q&A chat box, and there were no questions. You were very thorough and appreciate that. So again, you've left us with plethora of resources and food for thought, and that's exactly what we wanted. So thank you so much, Claire. Thank you. And that will end our.
So I do have a question for all of you. This is EPA Region 4 in the Southeast, and you have particular kinds of climate disasters that you have. The wet kind is the same way that the upstate and Northeast do. But what's been the EPA 4 regional office experience with respect to hurricanes, floods, tornadoes?
So when that takes place, we do have a group, a staff of individuals who are part of our hurricane response. And when we get questions or we know of a school that's in the path or has been in the pathway, received damages, we try to work with the key individuals within that school site to identify what the issues are and how to develop a remediation plan. Sometimes that's very difficult because schools are autonomous, and to have a cold call and say, well, I know you were in the path, is there anything I can do? Sometimes that's a little difficult to navigate, but where our staff are on the ground and they're working within various communities and schools are asking for assistance, we certainly reach out to them. So that's what we've done. And so,
right, and that happened, I think, during the beginning of the pandemic as well. Of the regional offices from EPA were reaching out. Certainly EPA at a federal level was providing a lot of webinar information on indoor air and ventilation. And that also was something that all of you distributed from the regional offices?
Yes, we did. Absolutely. I was aware, a part of several of those webinars, and making sure that our schools had access to the latest and greatest information that we had on hand, so that they had a comprehensive look at schools reopening after the pandemic, and make sure that they, especially, dealing with pesticides, that was a big issue, and exposure. So we made sure that schools had access to the latest and greatest information.
Mhm. We just did one of the very complicated issues that has been coming up more frequently now is the issue of PCBs in the old light ballasts. We just took a look at New York happens to have a system of building condition surveys done once every 5 years, and I think we determined in the state there were well over 1,000 schools that were built between 1950 and 1979 that would be very strong candidates for having PCBs, not only in the fixtures but in the caulk.
Mhm.
That is a tremendous problem.
That's something our team, there's another staff within the Region 4 where we met and we talked about that. What do we know? Are we receiving requests from schools for assistance in dealing with that? And at that time, and that's been about 4 or 5 years ago when we had that discussion, we did not have a Region 4 school or system that came to us asking for assistance. But what we found out is that many of them were looking at this and doing their own remediations. And we have a local school district in Fulton County that's what they had done. And they were sharing with us some of the things that are the actions that they had taken. So we are keeping an eye out and, willing to provide technical assistance and assist any school that need assistance to remediate. So let me check the chat box to make sure that we don't have any additional questions. Okay, I don't see any available or that have been posted at this time. So Claire, did you have any final comments or remarks?
No, but I'd be happy to take a live question if somebody wants to unmute.
Your slide deck, I know you've shared it with us. Are we at liberty to share it with, individuals who might want to take a look at what you?
Yes,
Okay.
This is a PDF. You're welcome to do that. I think if you post your video here, everybody will see the slide deck. You can include a link to it if you put a package together, if you'd like to. It might be easier to access that way.
And I'll just let all of our attendees know that we do have a plan to update our Children's Health regional page with each of our webinar series recordings. So this will not go away. We still have, we'll have access to your wonderful presentation for months to come. So we appreciate you.
That's great. I think one of the things that's most important to do, we didn't stress it a lot here, but given the need to improve indoor air generally, and given the need to reduce hazards in schools, one of the quickest, fastest things that schools can do at literally no cost, pennies, is switch over to green cleaning products and safer pest control. They actually save money. It may take a little bit to get started, but it's a terrific way to reduce the impacts on the indoor environment. One of the things we found when New York required all schools to use third-party certified cleaning products, and I think effectively in 2006. And one of the things it did is it reduced the number of public health complaints coming out of buildings because the air was a lot easier to breathe. It's not a perfect system. Not everybody's doing it well, but it's done a lot for a lot of people. and there are quite a few states that have gotten involved in it. We have our own website maybe I can't get back to it, but if you go to healthyschools.org and look for clean and healthy products across the top banner, there's a lot of startup information, simple fact sheets for parents, simple fact sheets for school facility directors, how to deal with vendors, where to find lists of products, and so forth. It really works well, and we really encourage people to try it out. It is so simple to make a switch and to have your favorite vendor come in and do a live demonstration with custodial staff. The custodian should know what products they're looking at, and they have a right to, we think, to pick the products they think are going to work best given, the flooring and the surfaces in the school building. So I don't want to leave without making that very specific recommendation of something you can do now without waiting for somebody else to do something else.
Absolutely. And safe use of cleaning chemicals has been something that EPA, as you know, Indoor Environments Division through Tools for Schools, we've talked about that for numerous years, and how it does save funding in terms of knowing what products you're using and the exposure to children, and making sure that those applications are done after hours, not during school hours, where someone may have an allergic reaction. So that's definitely something that we promoted. Thank you for bringing that up.
Right. So one of the things that happens, the people who certify products, Green Seal and Eco Logo, have required the manufacturers to add to the product label whether or not it has added fragrances to it. And as a result of that, and because of tracking of product use in New York State, not of schools, but of the state agencies, which are also doing this, it's something like 70 to 75% of the state agencies are voluntarily picking scent-free products, cleaning products to use in their buildings. It doesn't cost any more money. It's just important to know what you're getting and how to reduce the overall impacts. But we're really proud that the state agencies that are doing that, and we think a lot of schools are too, but we don't have the data.
That is great. I'm really happy to hear that. We've posted in the chat for everyone to see the Healthy Schools Network website, so they can go in and take a look at the references or resources that you've identified. And so, again, we just appreciate you for joining us and sharing your wealth of knowledge with us. You're definitely a great champion, and we're glad to have you with us today.
Well, thanks so much, LaShawn, and thanks so much to everybody in Region 4. This has been a real treat to visit you again. I think we did a webinar in the spring, right?
Yes, we did. We did the Healthy Learning Environments Conference in the spring. Yes.
Good. Well, thank you again.
Thank you, Claire, and thank you to all of our attendees for joining us today. And someone is already saying great presentation. So, and that's exactly it. So we appreciate you for making this happen for us. And have a great rest of the day and stay safe.
We'll try.
Okay, bye-bye.